Um, I hope you can hear me, yes? My name is John Getz, and I wanted to introduce this event a little bit and kind of give you a sense of how we want to construct the conversation tonight. The idea that we had was basically to think about the case of Edward Snowden as a kind of stress test, as you know what they do with banks, where they basically kind of see how do banks perform in a very difficult situation. And if we kind of step back for a moment from the Snowden case and not look at the NSA documents, not look at the content for a moment, but in terms of the question of source protection, in terms of the question of a high-value source, Snowden is interesting because he kind of raises the stakes. He kind of, the contradictions are more heightened in the Snowden case than they are, let's say, when someone from the health industry, the health ministry reveals that a restaurant got rats in the basement or something. And you also, the nice thing about the Snowden case is that you also have huge international players involved in the event. And so that's why the idea is to kind of use the Snowden case to reflect and hopefully to try to understand something about the state of journalism, the state of international journalism. And so, first of all, we're going to introduce ourselves, and then I have some questions for the audience, so be prepared to raise or not raise your hands. My name, as I said, is John Getz. I'm an American, but I've worked in Germany for 26 years. I work for the Süddeutsche Zeitung, as well as for German public television. We have an investigative cooperation between German public television and the Süddeutsche Zeitung. I was originally involved in the WikiLeaks stuff that happened with The Guardian and the New York Times back in 2010, which is how I first got to know WikiLeaks. And related to Snowden, the interesting thing is that I did a film about how Edward Snowden managed to leave Hong Kong. And by the way, we're very lucky to have Ewan McCaskill here in the audience, who was one of the journalists who was in Hong Kong with Laura Poitras and Edward Snowden in those decisive, interesting days. And I really hope that Ewan can contribute as much as he possibly can.
Poor Ewan.
And poor Ewan. And Stefania Maurizi is going to introduce herself. I just want to say that she also was involved in the research for the film about how Snowden managed to leave Hong Kong at that point. And Sarah Harrison of WikiLeaks was the person who was very much involved in Snowden leaving Hong Kong and figuring out options and accompanying him from Hong Kong and then to Moscow, to the airport in Moscow, and then spending, I forget how many days, 39 in the airport with Snowden until he was granted asylum by the Russian authorities. But she'll introduce herself, I just wanted to say. So, Stefania.
So thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Stefania Maurizi. I'm an investigative journalist working for the Italian news magazine L'Espresso and for the Italian daily La Repubblica. The reason why I'm here basically is that I started working on leaks and revelations and WikiLeaks and partnering with WikiLeaks since 2009, and throughout these years I got a lot of experience on leaks and leakers, whistleblowers, and so on. So I'm happy to discuss these things with you, and I welcome all sorts of questions and provocation and controversy, whatever.
My name's Sarah Harrison. I work at WikiLeaks. I have done since 2010, the summer of 2010, from the Afghan War Logs release. I'm also now currently the director of an organization called the Courage Foundation, which was set up in the wake of Snowden getting asylum and the understanding that there were very few organizations, if any, that were able to help journalistic sources in these high-risk situations. We now have a number of beneficiaries that we are supporting.
My name is Davide Dormino. I'm an artist, and I'm the creator of the sculptures that probably you saw on the square about Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and Julian Assange, with the empty chair next to them.
I'm going to try a little experiment just to kind of ask the audience just in the beginning about how you, as an editor perhaps, not necessarily as a journalist, if you were responsible for a big publication, how you would deal with the following situation. And the first question is, if you had a source, would you feel a source, some kind of high-level source, would you feel comfortable, please raise your hands if you say yes, would you feel comfortable not naming the source if the source requested that the source not be named? I assume that everyone raised their hand and says yes, right? Now it gets a little trickier. Would you give legal advice to that source? Do you feel that it's okay and ethically okay as journalists? Does it taint your objectivity if you provide legal advice to a source like Snowden? Is that okay? How many of you would do that? Raise your hands if, so only a few of you. The rest of you would not give him legal advice, is that right? Or do you not understand what I'm doing? Okay. Oh, you're not journalists. Okay. I thought people were journalists. So the question kind of continues about would you, and then you don't need to raise your hands because it's not working.
Well, even if they're members of the public, would they feel that the journalism had been tainted if they found out that the journalist had given legal advice?
If you're a reader, if you're not a journalist, if you're not an editor, but as a reader, do you feel that the information you would get from a newspaper or television broadcaster that came from a source where the newspaper paid for the person's hotel, would that be something that would taint your information, taint the stories? How do you feel about that? Okay, no response. Okay. These are some of the central questions that came up, though, in Hong Kong in the summer of 2013 about how to behave with someone who the US government was trying to hunt, right? And that's one of the things that we wanted to talk about. So, Stefania, perhaps you could say, first of all, how would L'Espresso and La Repubblica see Edward Snowden in that situation? Would they see him as a fugitive from justice, as the White House was saying at the time? Would they see him as a source? Would they see him as a spy? What would be the L'Espresso situation?
Yes, I think from this point of view, I'm lucky because L'Espresso has a great tradition in human rights, civil liberties. So they immediately understood what the case was about. It was about a source providing documents about a massive, very powerful organization, spy organization, and providing these documents, explosive documents, top secret documents never seen before, to journalists, not selling documents, not giving documents to spies, to Chinese spies, Russian spies, providing these documents, putting these documents in the hands of journalists for publishing, so revealing information in the public interest. I think I was lucky from this point of view because we understood immediately what the case was about, and we immediately understood how important it was to have the case right since the beginning. since the beginning, because we understood that the Pentagon, the US government, was ready to crush this source.
But I'm sorry if I interrupt, but do you actually really believe that I'm interested that the leadership of L'Espresso and La Repubblica, if the US government had applied pressure to the Italian government, this man is a fugitive, he has committed crimes, he's a thief, he's stolen, he's jeopardizing Italian military abroad. I mean, it's not as easy. I don't know that it's as easy as we might think at first to make the decision. Oh, of course we would do that.
Well, of course, I know. I'm sure they would have been in a nightmare situation for the legal risks. They are very concerned, especially in these days, you know, where news organizations are under serious pressure from the economical point of view to cope with the legal risks. I think it would be a nightmare situation for my news organization. But when we were looking at the case, we understood that basically we had the source providing document to journalists. I mean, there was nothing different. He was not hiding these documents, providing these documents to a government, to a foreign government, to spies. He was providing documents for publication, publication in public interest. So, I mean, when I can tell you that when we worked with Glenn Greenwald on the publication of the Snowden files, my organization was so under pressure from the legal point of view. They consulted all sorts of legal advisors to understand what legal risk we could have, what kind of libel case, what kind of civil damages, and so on. So I'm not sure about the legal, what can happen if tomorrow a source leak these documents to us, and the Italian government and the US government tell my bosses, look, this one is a criminal, be very careful because you will pay 1 billion euro in civil damages and so on. You will go to jail for 10 years for revealing state secrets. I think my bosses will be in a very, very, very tough situation. But in the case of Snowden,
No, but the question is, if you were in Hong Kong and it wasn't clear where it was going, would they have given you money for his hotel?
I think so. I think they are.
Okay.
I think they are. Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Now, let me just.
I can tell you that I'm a rebel, so I would have told them, look, I will go ahead because I think this is the right thing to do, and I think I would do that kind of things. But I think they will cooperate. Of course, they will ask 10 lawyers, and you know.
But there's a real question about aiding and abetting a criminal, right? And there are lots of lawyers in the situation who would say you can't do that. And that's why, Sarah, that's something Sarah came to Hong Kong in the summer of 2013 when Snowden was in a situation of he didn't know what to do. Should he stay in Hong Kong? Should he leave? He was in confusion. So try to set us up in that situation, if you would, and what he was facing at that moment.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons he's explained that he went to Hong Kong was that they have a large tradition of free speech. They also have some very good laws to do with, they also have some very good refugee laws and asylum laws that he was hoping to be able to use. What he hadn't understood, and who would because it's a very complex legal situation, is what happens with the cross-section between extradition and asylum requests. And the actual situation in Hong Kong is that although they wouldn't have they may not have necessarily, once he'd got an asylum application in, they can't necessarily extradite immediately, but what he hadn't understood was that the asylum request can take up to 25 years. Although they're often favorable, they have a very long process in Hong Kong. And because of the extradition request that would have cross-sectioned with it, he would have spent those 25 years in a basically a Chinese prison, which I'm sure you can all imagine would not have been the nicest place to spend that time. So then it became an issue of, well, what could he do? And understanding what became very clear very quickly and was probably predictable to most people was how politicized this case would become. Right at the beginning of July, Jay Carney, the White House press secretary, came out and actually stated that the US government were lobbying any country that he may have attempted to go to refuse any asylum requests for him, which is actually an extraordinary thing to actually come out and say that they are going to interfere in international law to try and stop somebody taking their legal rights to asylum. But that is what they said. So we can see very clearly that the US government really was just tramping around the world, trying to ensure, albeit extrajudicially, that Snowden wouldn't find any safe haven anywhere. So with this all in play, and with it being very complex in Hong Kong of the actual situation for him, he wanted to see what other options there were. So he actually reached out to us, I believe amongst others, but for us, he came to, I think, because we have a experience in asylum cases in a politicized environment. So between our contacts, that experience, and also we are, as he knew very well, experts in operating securely and communicating with encryption already, that we were a natural organization to go to that might be able to help and offer advice, and we did.
And in the summer of 2013 in Hong Kong, how important was the Hong Kong public in that situation? How important? There were demonstrations, there was a very strong, there had been stories that came out in the local press about NSA spying in China. That's kind of been forgotten since then, but that came out, and there was a lot of very strong public opinion. What role did that play in kind of the calculus of whether to stay in Hong Kong or leave Hong Kong at the time for Snowden and you helping him at the time?
I think it definitely helped a lot because, again, because this wasn't just about law, this was about politics. And so with that, being able to show the Hong Kong government that actually where the public opinion lay and any retaliation that they might get en masse from the public, what that would be, this was very important in helping to set up and understand the actual lay of the land there and what different countries in the world might be willing to do. It's an interesting point to me, actually, that and actually quite sad as a European citizen, that the number of countries in Europe that despite demonstrations, Germany is a big one for that, there have been many calls for asylum for Snowden, that they've actually ignored their public and they've backed down to the US demands. But I don't think that makes it any less important the public show their opinion. I think it is vital to show where the public stand on these matters, and hopefully bit by bit governments will start to listen.
Davide, maybe you can tell us something about your idea behind the sculpture that you did and the sense of kind of public opinion around this case.
The WikiLeaks story impressed me a lot from the beginning. And after the Snowden case, I felt the responsibility, like an artist, to do something for that. So with my friend, an American journalist, his name is Charlie Glass, we decided to start to think about an idea, a monument, sculptures for them. The first idea was to do something for the people, for inform the people about what these three icons or contemporary heroes did for us. And so it was, from the beginning, in my mind, the idea is to do something about the courage and to do something to give the opportunity to people to change their point of view or their position. So from that moment, the idea was clear to represent them over the chair, no? Like someone that have lost their comfortable zone. And it was an invitation, the empty chair, it was an invitation to people to stay close to there, to take a position, because, you know, if we know the truth, if we have the courage to know the truth, we can decide what is right and what is wrong. So that was my idea, and I did it.
Can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
On your statue as well, one thing I like is your title and the fact of the empty chair, and it very much sort of puts, it's called Anything to Say, and it very much puts the question to a member of the audience, do you have anything to say? And of course, most people actually do, and the other three people on the chairs are people that have actually, not only did they have something to say, they've stood up and said it, and they have obviously been retaliated against. So it's a symbol of solidarity, I suppose, as well. And I did like when you launched it in Berlin, and you got everybody standing on the chair.
You was the first woman standing on the chair.
Thank you.
This guy.
But there was the cutest thing where this little boy got up and had a rant about his nursery class where the teacher was being biased about this or that, and it was just very cute. I liked it a lot.
But I actually think that we've kind of gone by it a little too quickly, the question of how difficult things were in that situation. I mean, I think one of the things that you mentioned is the amount of pressure that was coming on from the American government at the time. And it's interesting not so much as the details of the past, but it's how would news organizations or media organizations behave in the future in a similar case. And I mean, I'm very surprised that you're just completely convinced that Espresso would give him money. I mean, because, one of the criticisms if you give him money for a hotel, right? And then that can easily get turned into, we paid the source, right? There's the question of, do you pay for a plane ticket? Do you help someone flee the place that they're in? I mean, you're convinced that your bosses would say, yes, you can try to smuggle them out of Hong Kong?
So, as I said, difficult for me. I can judge based on my experience, but I never had such an experience like Snowden, so I really don't know. I can tell you that, things are quite clear. We have a precise professional duty. It is not only a matter of human decency, it is also a matter of professional duty to protect source. And it was clear at that point that Snowden was a source, a proper journalistic source. I mean, he was not bombing, he was providing information and documents, extremely explosive documents to journalists. How do you call him? A spy, a criminal?
But there are lots of Italian journalists who call him a spy.
Of course they are, of course. Yes, absolutely they are. And that's why we understood immediately, well, we had to set the debate right, because they will crush him. There will be an info war, a media war against Snowden that they will destroy him. So it is really important for us to be on the right side, because the world was watching, The world was watching. And if we get Snowden wrong, who could reveal other new explosive and really crucial information if we get it wrong?
I mean, maybe Ewan can mention something about his experience, but also Sarah. I mean, I'm curious, the team that was there, it was an interesting situation because there was basically a blogger for The Guardian, Glenn Greenwald, was present in the initial time with Edward Snowden. There was Laura Porteous, who's a filmmaker, who ended up later winning the Oscar for her film. And there was Ewan McCaskill from The Guardian, who was a traditional reporter in that sense. And the Washington Post was actually invited to come to the event to meet Snowden, and one has to remember, perhaps you can explain why they didn't come, Sarah.
I wasn't there on that.
Yeah,
So
no, but I mean from what you know about what happened.
You know more about that from your film, no?
Okay. No, I mean just from what I know from the newspapers is that the leadership of the Washington Post basically...
I mean, they were worried about legal ramifications, but I don't know specifically the details that they had in their conversations. But they were worried legally that if they were going to deal with somebody in that sort of scenario, that there would be legal issues and retaliations for them as a newspaper for having interacted with him in that way.
And what was the situation that you found him in when you arrived? I mean, what had Poitras, Greenwald, and The Guardian, how had they left him at that point? I think one point to remember is that I think Snowden requested that he be left alone, if I remember correctly, or what was...
Yeah, I mean, both sides have explained that he did actually say his main priority was to ensure that the documents got out. And that he didn't sort of risk it all for anything. And so the safest way that was decided was that once the actual handover had happened and the explanation was that the journalists did leave to ensure that they could protect the material. And they did as he requested. And so, yeah, so then he was sort of left alone. By the time I landed, I think they left the next day or 2 days after or something like this. So yes, so the documents then were safe and he was alone.
Because I think people, because he got asylum in Russia later on, people assumed that from looking backwards that was the natural course of events. But actually, at that point, if I understand things correctly, he was basically waiting to get picked up. He was waiting to get arrested. And the fact that that didn't happen is because people did things or didn't do things. So
yeah, I think he said several times that he just sort of assumed from what he did he would end up in prison. So I think that actually, other than passing the documents on, that was sort of the goal. And other than setting it up in what hopefully would give him some options, and therefore choosing Hong Kong and, you know, he's obviously very intelligent, so being sensible enough not to be doing this within the United States and on US soil, or in any place where they had proper jurisdiction, that he would at least have potentially some options. Hong Kong is also a flight hub. So I think he was sort of sensible to try and leave some potential options, but it was just sort of an assumption that, well, how can you do that? Particularly when it's against the, you know, it's about the NSA. So they're going to really be after him. I mean, this is the leader in global intelligence services. So, like, how they're not going to find this one man running around Hong Kong, I mean, I think it sort of beggars belief from everybody that he would even get away from it and not be caught. So I think sort of any concept of going into any detailed planning afterwards didn't sort of even really figure on the radar too much.
How was he financially at that point?
He had, I mean, obviously he'd had a well-paid job, so he had some money, but there was, from sort of the second the publication started, there was the big worry that his money systems would be cut off. And this was something that, I mean, from our point of view, we were very aware of, having undergone an illegal banking blockade against us when we started publishing documents on the US. All our banking donation mechanisms were actually cut off. So it was obviously expected that the same thing would happen to him, and he would have access to no money, regardless of whether he, in theory, had it or not.
And how important were secure communications, and how available, I mean, and when I say secure communications, does this mean that you, I don't know, I mean, how did you communicate, and how important was that at that stage?
I used a lot of encrypted communications. It's important to understand here that the encrypted communications were, of course, vital, but the most important thing was actually a full understanding of those softwares available and the whole sort of operational risks. For example, it's easier to explain with an example. Many of the people that I needed to get advice from did not have encrypted communications, wouldn't even know what I was talking about. A number of lawyers there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and to set them all up, all of the people that I needed to speak to, I mean, it would have taken me 6 months to get them all set up and trained on it. So by which stage, of course, he'd be in prison and in the same situation as Manning. So there were actually times when I did things that, you know, people now would be like, oh my God, you know, that wasn't encrypted, how did you do that? But it was an understanding of how these systems worked. I'm very lucky that Julian Assange, my boss, is one of the world leaders in understanding these things and has been since he was a teenager. So he was able to guide, direct, and has been teaching me for a number of years on this. So for example, the use of burner phones in a correct way was very important to me. These were not encrypted. These could, within a few days, have easily been tracked down to me. But I knew that basically I had a few days to get him out, or it would all be game over anyway. It didn't matter whether they'd have gotten a phone call or they could get the records of the phone call later. They probably have the records of those phone calls now, and it actually doesn't make any difference because the goal has now been achieved. So yes, it was the knowledge of encrypted communications for some of the things that I was doing. That was very important, particularly heavy and multiple layers of encryption were used when speaking to Julian. He, of course, was in the Ecuadorian embassy at this time, surrounded 24/7 by British police surveilling the embassy. So being able to speak to him in any manner involved many, many layers of encryption and very complex things. But for some of the other people, I was not using that for some of the people I was dealing with. So it was both sides. It was the encryption, but an understanding in an overall way of this type of security and how to operate in that manner.
Stefania, let me ask you a question, because I remember when going to The Guardian way back in 2010 for the initial Chelsea Manning leaks, and we were asked to kind of have secure communications before we came when I was at Der Spiegel, and we didn't know what secure communications were. I mean, we all had Google accounts, and we're communicating everything on Google and talking on the phone. I mean, we had absolutely zero skills in any way at all. And we thought the most secure thing you could do was have conversations on Skype. We were convinced that Skype was the best thing. I mean, I'm being honest. I mean, and that's why, Stefania, let's say there was someone from Nespresso in Hong Kong who was not Stefania Maurizi. Would Nespresso, or let's not, we can try other Italian media, would they have been equipped with the knowledge of how to communicate securely?
Absolutely not. There is no. I'm not trying to attack colleagues or polemize, and I'm really serious about this. I'm really isolated, I would say, because in 15 years of my journalistic experience, I never ever met a colleague using encryption, seriously protecting communication with sources. I mean, my obsession started, the reason why I started working on these things is because in 2007, one of my sources was crashed. Luckily, it didn't depend on me. I didn't get anything wrong, but the source was really crashed. And there was no opportunity. I was totally unable to learn what she had discovered. The source had stumbled on something really explosive. I have no idea what the thing was about. And basically, the source experienced tailing, surveillance, and all sorts of awful things. So at that point, I realized I must do something. I must find a solution to communicate securely with my sources. And that was why I got interested in 2007 in encryption, in secure communication, and that's why I started getting involved in these kind of things and discovered WikiLeaks thanks to one of my sources who had trained me in some kind of encryption. So there is not this awareness, and this is a disaster. I just want to say, I mean, recently I was physically attacked, stolen important things, luckily, that material was well protected, you know? You understand this, how important it is when you seriously are under threat and your sources are under threat. So I hope that things will change. I hope that things will change soon, because I consider that a serious problem that in Italy, encryption, secure communication, and even awareness about these things is definitely not common, absolutely not common. And when you start discussing this with colleagues, they say, oh, you are paranoid, you think everybody is about WikiLeaks and Snowden, so the real world is not so, there are not so many threats. This is not true. I mean, this is not, absolutely not true.
It's just a personal gratitude of mine to Snowden's. One of the main ones is that I cannot explain how much of my life was spent like this when trying to explain to journalists as we'd approach them to be media partners on a project that no, we needed to set up encrypted communications for me to explain the leaked documents that we had to them. And there were so many times when journalists would be like, oh, really? That seems like a faff. Can't you just tell me on the phone? Just at least a bit about what it's about. And I'm like, no, that's the whole point. And now at least, thankfully, post-Snowden, when I, contact someone to see, we're working on something, could you set up, X, Y, Z, etc. I'll talk you through it and help you do it. Now, thankfully, most journalists actually go, okay, yeah, I'll take half an hour to actually learn how to do this. So he's made my life a lot easier in that way, and I will forever give him many thanks for that. But still, there's a lot of training to do with the operations. I still have some where suddenly you'll be speaking to a journalist, and then suddenly they stop replying, and then you say, a bit later they responded, where did you go? Oh, I'm just in an internet cafe and I just went off to the toilet. What, you left the whole conversation open like that? Madness. So yeah, there's still a long way to go, but I do feel at least with some journalists there is an understanding that if you want to protect your sources, if you don't want the government to find out what you're doing to create their spin before you actually publish, that you are going to need to encrypt your communications. But there's still a long way to go on that.
I mean, there could have possibly been a fourth figure in the sculpture that you did, and it's John Kiriakou. And the reason I mentioned the John Kiriakou case, it's very interesting because I think a lot of us journalists hear this about encryption and secure communications, and it seems like frequently a lot of the people talking about it is kind of, why do they have to be so irritating? Do you know what I mean? Like, why do they have to kind of interrupt my day with this stuff about encryption? Do you know what I mean?
Glenn said right at the beginning when Snowden was emailing Glenn, he just ignored the whole thing. Snowden spent how many months trying to teach Glenn PGP? And it all just seemed too complex. He just completely ignored him.
Yeah, I'll move on in my life.
It was thankfully only because, Laura worked with us for quite some time, and so she had these communications, so when he reached out to her and then she finally prodded him, was like, I think actually you may want to go back into your email chain a little bit and take this one seriously.
But let me just as briefly as possible, just mention this John Kiriakou case. He was a member, he worked for the CIA, and he was in email contact with a journalist from ABC Television, who later on was fired for this stuff, but who was on a Google Mail account, who kept on emailing his boss, now Kiriakou has told me the name of the following CIA people who tortured. Now my source has told me this. And he kept on emailing his boss all of the great results that he got. And these emails were then used to convict Kiriakou and give him a prison sentence. I can't remember how many years it was. A man with five children, young children. I mean, it's a real cautionary tale about how necessary it is to protect your communications, because you can really send someone. Now, to be fair to the journalists, this did happen before the Snowden case, just so. But you were going to say.
Yes, I want to say that basically our serious problem as a journalist is not when you deal with sources who are able to use encryption. I mean, I'm confident to protect those kind of sources because they are able to use encryption. My problem is with the 99% of sources who are unable to use encryption. That's a serious problem. really is a nightmare. And you know, when you try to make them realize that basically you are suggesting these kind of things, the security, operational security, security, communication security, you realize that they are scared. So they starting, well, maybe it's dangerous. And in fact, many of my colleagues tell me, please don't discuss these things with the sources because no one will talk to you anymore. But you cannot deal with these things just not mentioning. I don't think it's the right approach. I don't think it's right to just avoid that the sources are not aware of the risk they are taking. I think it is the time to start changing things and face these problems and have a huge debate between in the journalistic community to start protecting sources seriously. Because this is, I mean, no one will talk to you anymore if we don't find a way to solve this problem. You know, we cannot play tricks. We cannot play the card that they don't know the risk. I don't think it is ethically feasible. And I don't think it is ethically acceptable.
In any time that the audience would like to contribute, say anything, please don't be shy. The idea is to have kind of a more dialogue. Yeah, go ahead, right ahead.
Microphone?
While we're waiting for the microphone. I mean, what's interesting to me is the sense of, I mean, how many organizations, I mean, there are lots of NGOs out there that work on journalistic issues. There are lots of committees to protect journalists and stuff. It's interesting to me how many kind of NGOs were actually in a position at that time to go and help Edward Snowden. What is your sense of that, Stefania?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, maybe, you know, serious. I have no idea. Okay. I cannot imagine who. Actually, no one did anything. I mean, not even tried. I mean, you know, ACLU and EFF, Electronic Frontier Foundation, I have not heard whether they even tried at all.
Okay, go ahead, yeah.
La faccio in italiano, ok? Quindi spero ci sia la traduzione, ok? Va bene, comunque.
A chi la domanda?
In generale.
Ok.
Va bene, innanzitutto
in Italian. She's asking. Yeah.
Mi chiamo Alessia Melchiorre e volevo chiedervi cosa cambierà con l'elezione del nuovo Presidente degli Stati Uniti per Edward Snowden, innanzitutto, e per la national security in generale negli Stati Uniti. Le politiche di sorveglianza di massa, eccetera, come cambieranno?
How will policies change with the new president?
Yeah. And what about the NSA? Do you think there will be changes after the election?
Well, I mean, of course, it all depends on who wins the election.
Yeah,
And that's all up in the air. We don't even know who are going to be the candidates. They're trying to figure out which candidates they're going to have. I mean, if it's Trump has said many times he'd like to have a more severe form of torture. And I know that Cruz has talked about patrols in Muslim communities and things like that. But it all depends on who wins. I mean, I think that's
I think on that subject, though, there's an interesting point in that one thing to remember is that there were actually, and there still are, laws in the United States supposedly regulating the NSA, and they were breaking those laws knowingly. So whether you're talking about presidents or the law or whatever, I'm not sure that the NSA and any changes in that are actually going to come down to any of these outside forces particularly. It's actually something that I've said quite a bit with anybody just lobbying. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying one shouldn't lobby to try and change the laws and make the laws more stringent and any oversight committees actually more effective. Of course, those things should be fought towards, but I think to assume that if any of those battles, if anything progresses in that manner, that it's going to actually fix the situation, I think is completely naive. We're talking about an incredibly large, unelected organization that ignores the laws anyway and has been operating in this way. I think the only thing, as we can see, that is going to make particularly much of a change is opening the entire thing up to a huge amount of public scrutiny. That's clearly the thing that they're not liking, that it's helping it. But I think just that, the fact that a president changed, I mean, just look at Obama and Guantanamo. I mean, he campaigned on the fact that he was going to close it, and he hasn't at all. So I don't think that any president is necessarily going to affect the NSA, no matter what they say. And particularly with the current potential candidates, I mean, and if you look, Clinton is campaigning alongside with Google, who are, okay, they're not the NSA, but intrinsically part of the digital mass surveillance issue. The closeness there just shows that, if anything, it would get worse, would be my prediction for her.
I want to add, just want to add quick. So I think in this country, if you take this country, interceptions are a big issue. No? You know, all sorts of political scandals here in this country are based on interception. Imagine an agency like the NSA, which is basically intercepted the entire planet. They can blackmail even God, you know? So I'm not sure whether any president could make a difference when it comes to the NSA. I'm really skeptic about this. I'm really skeptical about the possibility that even if we have the best president in the world, there will serious changes, serious reform.
And Bill Binney talks about that, a previous to Snowden, an NSA whistleblower, and they call it grey mail, this sort of not quite blackmail, but a kind of that's what you want to do. Do you remember that conversation that you had, or that hotel room that you had last July? And then, you know, that stops it. So that's actually quite a used method. So yes, so again, as you're saying, I don't think different elected officials necessarily have much power over this organization.
I mean, we can check when we journalists have interception, we are powerful, we feel ourselves very powerful because we can kick the powerful with this interception. Imagine that these guys have interceptions about world leaders, the Pope, whoever. Imagine how powerful, what their power to blackmail people. Imagine how huge.
But I would like to, if possible, try to remember that I think if there's a new Edward Snowden, I actually don't think that the state of journalism right now is actually prepared to deal with it. I actually don't think we've learned the lessons of what happened in Hong Kong back then. But maybe that's just me that wants to talk about that. Go ahead.
My name is Andrei Soldatov, and I'm a Russian investigative journalist. And let me bring a bit of Russia into this debate. Can I have your comment on the way WikiLeaks responded to Panama Papers, which is maybe the biggest journalistic scoops of this year? And,
into what?
How
Panama
we
Papers.
responded to the
Panama Papers.
There were two tweets made by WikiLeaks. And the first one said that Panama Papers actually an attack on Putin, funded by US government. And the second one actually questioned integrity of all journalists.
Let's keep it to one question, and then we move.
No, he's saying
there's
the
about
two
7
tweets.
people.
It's the same question.
It's actually the same question about two tweets made by WikiLeaks about OCCRP investigation.
Yeah. Okay.
And the problem is that, as far as I know, a lot of journalists feel quite strange because, say, in Russia, journalists who were involved in this project were journalists from Novaya Gazeta, and many of journalists of this Novaya Gazeta were killed. And now their integrity were questioned by WikiLeaks. And just yesterday, Vladimir Putin picked up this question and said, look, because now we have WikiLeaks saying that the whole thing was funded by US government, I know that this attack on me was directed by US government. So do you have any comment on that?
I definitely do. So first off, I'd like to be 100% clear and not just reprint the biases and the spin that's being, restate the spin that's being used on this. So first off, we have been hugely positively publicizing the Panama leaks right from the start. In fact, we joined in the countdown towards it. We have been very, very supportive of that and the whole entire leak. That's the first thing to say. However, the second thing to say, please do not make me responsible for what Putin says. It's really, what Putin says and does is really nothing to do with me. Okay, but then the crux of your question, which is about what we've said about the bias and the American funding. And it is actually a very important and correct point. And that this is, if you take, so this is a leak about the financial industry. Who are the two biggest global players in the financial industry? That's the United States and the United Kingdom. So if you're journalistic organizations and you have access to all of this, it is very interesting, and I do believe it is questionable, that the first thing that you go to is looking up Putin and Russia. And what's interesting is that Putin isn't actually in it, it's advisors. And it is very clear when you read those reportings that have come out that it is being used as basically an attack on Putin to try to give that angle. And the funding from that organization does come from USAID. Now, I would also like to point out that we did clarify within the tweets that there are many, and in fact, a number of them have been our partners, Novaya Gazeta, Bivol, etc. The individual organizations within that conglomerate that is the OCC PR organization are great. And have done, we've partnered with, they've done excellent independent journalism. But that organization as a whole is funded by the United States government. And so our tweets were just posing the question that, this is clearly a cherry picking of a very large data set and does look as though there is an anti-Russian agenda in that cherry picking. I mean, it's basically taking a quite obvious, from that data set, the headlines, I mean, you can see the Cameron one, for example. This has now started to become big news in the UK. But these sorts of ones weren't necessarily the stories that were led with. It was the Putin ones were. So this is what our the tweets were trying to point out. It's been we've actually seen quite a lot in the publishing that we've done with media partners where biases are picked and you can follow it through to the money. And so we're just trying to, those tweets are trying to sort of question whether there is a bias in that type of reporting.
Other questions? I'll just please raise your hand if you have another question. Just one thing, as someone who was marginally involved in Panama Papers, I mean, I do know that the team involved basically looked in any country, in any direction, in any way they could find, looking for whatever stories they could find. I know that we in Germany spent, an untold amount of time trying to find as many German cases as possible, and I think all of the partners had that job. So, further questions? Yeah, Ewan, please. Or comments, please.
This isn't Ewan McCaskill from The Guardian. This isn't a question. It's to go back to the question you posed at the start about obligations to sources. In Hong Kong, the Guardian policy is not to pay anybody ever for a story, because we feel that if you do that, you've tainted the source. In Hong Kong, after we've been in Hong Kong for a few days, and we're busy interviewing Snowden, going through the documents, and writing stories, and not getting much sleep. In the middle of all this, Laura said to me, "What's The Guardian going to do to help Snowden?" And which is a very good question. And basically, I didn't have an answer to that. I didn't know what the best thing, to do was to help them. And I got in touch with the editor of The Guardian, Alan Rusbridger, and said, once this story breaks, Snowden is revealed as the source, what can we do to help? And Alan says, well, what can we do? And I said, well, he's almost maxed out his credit card. So, can we help pay his hotel bills? He's almost certainly going to end up fighting an extradition case in the Hong Kong courts. Are we prepared to pay his legal fees? And Alan's first response was, well, that's going to be difficult. He's a source, and if the Guardian is seen to be paying a source, then that would taint the story. It's the point that John made at the outset. But Alan said, well, maybe we could think about paying his hotel bills, and maybe we could think about paying his legal fees. Let's see what happens. As a sort of compromise, he sent out the Guardian's chief lawyer, Jill Phillips, who is very rarely mentioned in this story. She came to Hong Kong the next day, and meanwhile, Glenn and maybe Laura arranged for two Hong Kong lawyers, Robert Thibault and Jonathan Mann, as possible representatives for Snowden. Jill Phillips came to Hong Kong, met Jonathan Mann and Robert Thibault and vetted them. Myself and Laura and Glenn saw the Guardian lawyer, Jill Phillips, and said, what about our own position? And she says, well, you've basically broken so many laws already. You know, just carry on. At this point, as Sarah said, we left Hong Kong. And my assumption was that I would go back. I'd go back to London, New York. Then I would go back to Hong Kong to cover the court case. I assumed that Snowden would fight the court case for 6 months or a year, and that eventually he'd be extradited back to America. And maybe at that point, the Guardian would have paid his legal fees. When I was back and Sarah went out to Hong Kong, and my initial response when I heard about what WikiLeaks and Sarah had done was to think that was a mistake, that Snowden had ended up in Moscow. He was heading for Latin America. It was a complete fiasco. I now realise that WikiLeaks and Sarah did exactly the right thing. It might not have been the end that they wanted, but it's exactly the right outcome. Russia is the only country in the world where Edward Snowden would be safe. If he'd ended up in Ecuador, which was the original plan, the US could have put pressure on Ecuador, either economically or diplomatically, or they would have sent a CIA squad into Ecuador within a month. They would have lifted Edward Snowden. The only country in the world where Edward Snowden is safe is Russia. So initially I was critical of WikiLeaks, but after thinking about it, I realised that it was exactly the right thing. And I applaud Sarah for going to Hong Kong and her bravery in sticking with Edward Snowden.
But Ewan, maybe I can just ask you one follow-up onto your comment. I mean, how do you think the Guardian would behave now in a similar? I mean, has there been a learning process? I mean, would the Guardian have helped him? Let's say it now perhaps get to Russia, or how do you? Has thinking changed since then?
Myself and Alan Rusbridger have been to see Snowden in Moscow twice, and we've asked him repeatedly how he feels the Guardian treated him, and they said that he says that the Guardian did well by him in terms of the news coverage. The combination of the Guardian, Der Spiegel, New York Times, everyone that was involved with this, he's happy. He got the documents, and Glenn and Laura's movie Citizen 4, huge exposure. That's what he wanted, so he's happy with the Guardian. I said to him, as an aside once, but you're not very happy with this for the way that we didn't protect you enough as a source. And he sort of shrugged, gave me a smile and said, yeah, you could say that. So if I've got any regrets about what happened in Hong Kong is that we didn't do enough to protect Edward Snowden. I'm not sure that we could have done anything more. the outcome that happened is the only one that worked best for him. Since we've gone back, we have changed our attitudes. Last time we were in Moscow, we said to Snowden, do you need money? Is there anything we can do for you? And he said no. And again, just to echo what Sarah said earlier, it's absolutely disgraceful that Germany, Switzerland, Scandinavia, maybe Italy, all these, the populations, politicians, journalists say Snowden did something worthwhile. He's disclosed the extent of mass surveillance. Yet none of these countries will offer him asylum. There is nowhere for him to go.
Yeah, I think that's a big point on the fact that he's in Russia. I completely agree with you. And I mean, it wasn't the objective, but it has actually worked out in the best possible scenario. But I mean, my main point on that is, isn't this the saddest thing in the world for the whole of Europe, that the only place this man is safe is in Russia? I've had meetings with various members from the German government since I've been living in Germany about this, and a number of them have said, like, we don't really want him here, we can't keep him safe. Even ones that do, they themselves do actually want to bring him to Germany. They don't actually trust their own intelligence services to work for them and actually protect Snowden, rather than do what the United States asked them to do. And I think this is an extraordinary position that we're in Europe at the moment, in that we're basically part of a US empire, and that Russia and China are basically the only opposing forces to this. And I'm not saying that, you know, they're great in every way. Of course, there's many issues with both those countries. But I do think that it is a sad but realistic state of affairs at the moment, that if we want to do something that the US disagrees with, then we have to turn to these countries.
I mean, one of the fascinating things about the work that I did, because it was about his time in Moscow, in the airport, in Hong Kong, and you basically get a different geography of the world when you actually look at the Snowden case. Because I think we kind of, you know, go around and we see kind of Western Europe as the place where the ideals of the Enlightenment exist, and the rule of law, and we're loyal to the UN. And what was really fascinating about the Snowden case, and that's why I think it's a kind of a lesson, is that when the stakes are high, it was amazing how Germany, which had mass demonstrations, you had leading politicians of all parties praising Edward Snowden, but when the shit hits the fan, Germany buckled down and refused, made a special cabinet decision not to give him, outside of the normal legal procedure, without even informing the justice minister, by the way. There was a cabinet decision made that he would not get asylum in Germany. And it's just, and basically it's kind of like when the tide goes out and you see these rocks kind of under the water, there's a different geography that you can see of Europe. And it was amazing to see how close Western Europe really was with the United States on this whole question. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm relieved that Italy did not offer asylum, not even try to offer, because I'm sure that there's no way he could be safe in Italy. I mean, we had the example of Vanunu. There was a rendition, he was rendered here in Rome in the 80s. So I have read, I learned the extent, I learned how Italy automatically behaved on the US behalf, thanks to the cables. I mean, when I was reading the cables, I was saying, look, I read 10 newspapers per day, and I didn't know all these things. How is it possible? Well, it's possible because we don't even realize how we automatically engage on the US behalf. But when you read these cables, you realize what happened. You know, so on the one hand, I'm relieved. On the other hand, I think the debate is totally wrong. We should discuss the shame, the situation, the fact that Europe didn't even try to provide any assistance. I mean, there is no serious debate. The whole debate is to blame WikiLeaks for Russia and to blame Russia, where the debate should be also about Europe.
Well, because there really was a lesson, and I think that lesson has basically been forgotten. There was actually kind of a moment where we actually could see the world in a more accurate way, and I just think it's kind of, I mean, so anyway, further questions? Any further questions in the back? Yes, sir. There's just one, while we're waiting for the microphone, there's one comment from Bill Graham, an old American music producer, about the Grateful Dead, and it was, it's not that they're the best at what they do, it's that they're the only ones that do what they do. And if you think about how WikiLeaks was the only organization that was willing to do it, I mean, it's really quite interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was in Dresden like 10 days ago and just popped out in Edward Snowden Platz. And first of all, I was shocked. I said, wow, it's really nice. I took a photo. Then I realized I was really sad because all is left actually looks like signs in cities, like just people are caring about this key case. So my question is, what are we going to do for Snowden now? And what are we going to do for the next Snowden? Do we need something like more WikiLeaks or more people that are independent from newspapers and from governments to help people like Snowden? Or do we need newspapers to act as WikiLeaks did? So have the expertise, being trained and skilled to help people like Snowden?
See, and I think this is where the issue also, where American funding on so many technology projects and NGOs actually does play a role. Because the question is that in a situation like Snowden, you're not just taking on your editors in terms of, and there was a massive American attempt to get him, right? And I mean, in terms of what you mentioned about Ecuador, the fascinating thing is that if Germany buckled down under American pressure, right, which is the largest economy of Europe, I mean, what chance would Ecuador have of withstanding that kind of pressure?
Just as a personal example on this matter, when just after leaving Russia, I was trying to find lawyers to get legal advice about my situation in the UK, where they'd opened a terrorism investigation whilst I was in Russia. The intelligence services had gone into The Guardian and forced them to destroy their hard drives, et cetera, so I wanted legal advice. And it actually wasn't that easy. I mean, you're thinking, find a lawyer should be independent. I actually had lawyers say, well, we actually get money from the government, so we're not going to take you. So, I mean, that's quite extreme. It just shows you, okay, it's the UK, not the US, but it's the same sort of thing, is that actually the money trail really does show the pressure. People are scared of losing their money stream, which is understandable, but therefore I'd really think it's a question, and at least should be understood by people that the money really does talk in that way.
We have time for one last question.
But none of us have answered the gentleman's question, though.
We have 5 minutes.
I think both. I actually think that we need more NGOs doing that. I think, for example, it's one of the reasons why we set up this organization that I'm director of, Courage, and that's we're specifically built for these high-risk cases, the politicized cases. For example, when we were in the airport, none of the NGOs could even work out how to set up a bank account that they were sure to collect donations for his legal fund that they could be sure would withstand blockade. And we'd actually managed to do this finally because of our banking blockade. So we had experience in this. So again, we were the only ones that could do this, which is when I was like, well, let's just set up an organization to do this. So there's one now. But I think that these lessons do need to be learned by, I would say, NGOs and media organizations, because it will depend a lot on the sources. I also think that it is, as much as I think that when it turns away from politics, when they become politicized cases, the law is essentially, or in some ways, irrelevant, or can be made irrelevant by the politicians. But I do think that maybe if we did look to changing laws, the way I would be pushing for it, and the way I do push for it, is not for national laws. I think you can have whatever law you want in the United States or Germany, you're not going to protect another Snowden. But if we had maybe an international law that was a bit more like the refugee laws, where you're sort of made to take them from one country to another, it's these sorts of things that I think we have to really look at, and that's where you're saying the lessons from the Snowden case are important, is we really saw how politics came into it. Even the classic case in this is Obama saying he wouldn't scramble jets for a 29-year-old hacker, and then blow me down the very next week. He's sending rendition planes at the ready, sitting around in Denmark, wasn't it? So Denmark was allowing this to happen. So I think that if we were having more cross-border laws, then we would maybe have, there's at least more possibility that these laws would work in some cases, so that if they're the whistleblower from Germany, other countries are sort of forced to take them, and if not, there's other countries within the agreement pressuring, well, why didn't you, etc., etc. But I think to keep it as a nationalized issue is just bound to fail.
Okay, one quick last question, please. Yeah.
Just a comment that in France we have a law that is going to pass to protect whistleblowers, but the agency that, just to comment that nationalizing is not the issue, because it will be under French government. So if French government interests are at stake, how can it protect the whistleblower?
Yeah, I don't think it would. There's interesting, when you look in detail, a lot of these proposed whistleblower laws, they're actually quite weak as well, because a lot of them still will have clauses for against national secrets and national security. And this is a very interesting one, because this whole term has now been blown up in some blanket way to sort of, well, pretty much anything. So when you actually look at a lot of these laws that are being proposed, I don't know the French one in detail, I'm sorry, but the German one I'm quite familiar with that they were proposing, and that had all sorts of caveats for national security, etc., etc. And so the proponents of it would be like, see, we can now protect Snowden, when actually if it was a Snowden case, the laws that are being proposed would definitely not protect. So I think that, yeah, these national laws are bad for both those ways.
Okay, I'm going to just read one last quote, and then that's the end of it's Stefania and Davide sent this to me. It's Bruce Sterling on what happened with Snowden, and the quote is, "It's incredible to me that among the 8 zillion civil society groups on this planet that hate and fear spooks and police spies, not one of them could offer Snowden one shred of practical help, except for WikiLeaks. This valiant service came from Julian Assange, a dude who can't even pack his own suitcase without having a fit." So, thank you for coming.